This is the live podcast with Manuel, living in full expression.
Most of us treat frustration as pure obstacle, something that happens to us, something to survive and move past as quickly as possible. But some frustrations are not obstacles at all. They are the exact force required to move something we would never have chosen to move on our own. Behind the thing you're frustrated about right now may be both what you would quietly giving up on finding and a mess you've been neglecting far longer than you realize. And living in full expression means learning to read frustration from its message, not just its inconveniences, and having the discipline to act on it instead of losing days to blame and wallowing. My wife and I got back from the mall over the weekend, unpacking bags, putting things away, some of it going on top of a fridge. She turned for a second to check on our child that is not yet 2 years old, and in that second, the loaf of bread she was holding slipped and fell behind the fridge. And she blamed the distraction, she blamed our child for distracting her. And on my own part, I felt the frustration as it landed too for me because I knew exactly what would come next. We're going to have to drag a full fridge from its spot just to get a loaf of bread back. So I did reluctantly, and when I finally pulled it out, I was not prepared for what we found. Welcome to the Live Podcast with me, your host Manuel. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about what's actually behind your fridge, the thing you gave up on, the mess you've been avoiding, and the frustration that might be the exact prompt you've been waiting for. So if you're ready, let's get started. So here's the pattern I want you to notice before I even finish telling you what happened behind that fridge that very day. Most of us are trained to interpret frustration, disappointment, and delays as evidence that something has gone wrong. A plan interrupted, a rejection, a setback, and the instinct is almost always the same. You feel annoyed, look for someone or something to blame, and either push through in irritation or quietly give up on the thing altogether. But frustration doesn't actually tell you anything about whether something has gone wrong. It only tells you that something has been interrupted. What that interruption actually means, whether it's a genuine setback or a redirection towards something you needed, is actually a separate question entirely, and it's one most of us never stop to ask. So history is full of this pattern, even in places you wouldn't expect. In 1968, a scientist at the company 3M was trying to build one of the strongest adhesive ever made for use in an aircraft construction. What he actually produced was one of the weakest adhesive anyone had seen. I mean, a failure by every measure. That failure sat on a shelf for years, considered existentially useless, until a colleague, frustrated that his bookmark kept flipping out of his hymn book during his choir practice, and he remembered the strange weak adhesive and used it to just create what we now know as the post-it note. The frustration of a slipping bookmark paired with a supposedly failed invention produced one of the most recognizable office products in the world. So that's not an isolated story, because if you ask around, you will find that a striking number of people only started building the life they actually wanted after a disappointment forced their hands. A door closing that seemed devastating at the time that later turned out to be the exact push they needed to stop cycling something safe and start building something real. But I'm not telling you this to romanticize pain, because some frustrations are simply painful, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But what I'm trying to tell you is that frustration on its own is not a verdict, it's a signal. And the work is learning to read the signal instead of reacting to the noise. Now, let me go back to the story that I started out on this and tell you the full gist. Because we just got back from the mall, bags everywhere. My wife was putting some things away, a few items going on top of the fridge. And then our baby, just less than 2 years old, I guess, needed a second of her attention. And in that second, a loaf of bread, dropped from her hand and fell behind the refrigerator. Well, she blamed the distraction. If I'm honest, in that moment, I found myself quietly blaming her for not, paying close attention. Neither of those reactions, helped anything. They just added irritation to an already annoying situation. Because here's what the fall actually meant. Practically, we were going to have to drag a full refrigerator out from its position in our kitchen to retrieve this loaf of bread that had just fallen. And this is not a small task, not something either of us wanted to do at the end of a long day of shopping and unpacking. So, but here's the detail that matters. It wasn't an insignificant item. It was bread we needed for breakfast the next morning. And leaving it there, back there, and not only do we not eat, the bread would definitely spoil and start to smell and eventually draw insects. So the stake was very real, enough that skipping the tax wasn't actually an option, no matter how much neither of us felt like doing it. So reluctantly, I dragged the fridge out. And the first thing we saw wasn't just the bread. It was my child's spoon, the exact spoon we have searched for days earlier, all over the house and eventually given up on, assuming it was lost for good. But also, along with that, we found several other small things our baby had apparently thrown under there over recent weeks that we would never even know were missing. And underneath all of it, dust and green that had clearly been building for a long time. So my wife got straight to cleaning it right there once we saw it. Now, when we were finally done, bread has been retrieved, spoon recovered, the space behind the refrigerator properly cleaned for what was probably the first time in a long while. I sat with what just happened, and it hit me clearly. That frustration, the frustration of that bread falling wasn't the setback it felt like in the moment it happened. It was actually the exact push we needed to finally deal with something we've already given up on finding, and a mess we didn't even know we would be ignoring. So the thing was, if it had been something small and unimportant that fell back there, probably we would have shrugged, left it, and told ourselves we would deal with it eventually. Would have procrastinated because this is not something significant. We would never have moved the fridge. It was the weight of what was at stake, our breakfast, the spoilage, the mess that forced the action neither of us wanted to take, but both of us needed to take it. So I want to slow down on something I mentioned earlier in this story because I think it's one of the most important parts of this whole lesson. In the moment that that bread fell, both my wife and I reached instantly for blame. She blamed the destruction of our child. I found myself, even if only internally, blaming her for not being more careful. Neither of those thoughts moved us 1 inch closer to actually solving the problem. They just cost us a few extra minutes of irritation before we finally got to work. Now, this is such a human pattern, and I want to name it plainly here. When something falls, breaks, or goes wrong, our very first instinct is almost never what does this require of me now? it's always, whose fault is this? We spend real energy assigning blames, sometimes to other people, sometimes to circumstances, sometimes to even ourselves. And that energy is already gone, just blaming ourselves or blaming situations or blaming circumstances. It doesn't come back once we are done blaming. It's simply spent, and the fridge still hasn't moved even an inch. Now, the second trap, and this one is more quieter, is the wallowing, sitting in the frustration itself, replaying it, feeling sorry for the inconveniences without ever actually getting up to move towards what the frustration is asking of us. Some people can stay in the space for hours, others stay there for years, treating a single disappointment as a life sentence rather than a single closed door pointing them to somewhere else. So here's what I want you to notice about both of these traps. Blaming and wallowing feels like they are doing something. They feel active, even justified, but they are in practice a very sophisticated way of delaying the actual required action. Every minute spent deciding whose fault the bread falling was a minute the bread spent sitting behind a dusty fridge, getting closer to spoiling. Now, the frustration was never actually the problem. The delay in responding to it was the problem. Now, I want to do something with you here. And I want to ask you real questions for us to also look at your life and uncover some of the scenarios in your life that may look like the fridge and the bread. And I want you to take an honest moment with each of those questions so that we are able to uncover this. And I'm going to also take it in layers. First of all, let's look at layer number one, the surface awareness. What is the current frustration, disappointment, or delay sitting in your life right now? I mean, the one you've mostly just been irritated by without asking what it might actually be pointing you towards. I want you to name it specifically, not the general complaint. I mean the actual event. And what have you concluded about it so far? That it's simply bad luck? That it's unfair? That it means something has gone permanently wrong? I want you to sit with your honest answer before you move to the next layer, because this is a very important foundation for us to uncover what this is and naming it clearly. Because when we name it clearly, we are able to sort it out. Now let's look at layer number two, where we go to the root identification. So let's go deeper on this. So here I want you to ask yourself, who and what have you been blaming for this frustration? Is it yourself, someone else, circumstances, timing, whatever it may be? I want you to be honest about how much energy that blame has actually cost you and how little it's actually moving you towards solving anything. If you notice you've always been wallowing, replaying the disappointment rather than acting on it, that is not a character flaw. That is a very common, very human way of avoiding a task that feels heavier than we want it to be right now. Okay? So let's look at layer number three now, which is the separation and the reorientation. So here's the distinction that changes everything. The frustration itself and the meaning you've assigned to it are two separate things. The event is neutral. The story you've told about it is not. What if this disruption isn't a punishment but a prompt? What is it actually asking you to finally move the way that fridge needed moving that you've been putting off? I want to repeat this question again so that it sinks properly. What if this disruption isn't a punishment but a prompt? What is it actually asking you to finally move the way the fridge needed moving that you've been putting off? And here's the practical question underneath all this. What is genuinely at stake if you leave this exactly where it is right now? Is this a loaf of bread? Something that will spoil and cost you real consequences the longer you have to leave it? Or is it something small enough to set aside without real cost? Because if it's bread, the discomfort of moving it is not optional, no matter how much you don't feel like it right now. But if it's genuinely small, you get to choose your timing without guilt. But either way, what might you find or finally clean up once you stop blaming and finally move the thing that's actually in your way? So here's how you turn what just surfaced into something practical in 4 moves. The move number 1 is name what fell. For us, it was the bread that fell behind the fridge. So you want to get specific about the actual frustration, the disappointment, or the delay currently sitting in your life. Because vague irritation doesn't move anything, but a named specific obstacle does. So you want to sit with that and find out and discover and write out and name out what this frustration is. Then number 2 is to weigh it. You want to ask honestly whether this is a bread or something insignificant. And you ask yourself, will leaving it cause real compounding consequences, such as spoiling, missed opportunities, mounting costs, or can it genuinely wait without harm? Let the answer determine your urgency, not your mood. Number 3, I want you to stop paying for blames. Notice the moment you reached for blame or start wallowing and name it out loud, even just to yourself. Because that noticing alone often breaks the spell enough to redirect the energy towards an action instead. And here's move number 4, move the fridge and look behind it. So I need you to take the actual required action. And once you do, actively look for what else might be there, what you've given up on, what's being quietly neglected, because the frustration rarely hands you back only what you were looking for. Oftentimes, it hands you a cleanup you didn't know you needed to. And if you want to walk through this fully, this week's premium worksheet walks you through naming your current frustration, weighing what's genuinely at stake, and building your specific plan to move the fridge this week. All right. There are 3 things I wanted to walk away with from this episode as I conclude. Number 1 is this: frustration is not always punishment. Sometimes it's the exact push required to move something you would never have moved on your own. Number 2, blame and wallowing feel active, but they are often just a sophisticated way of delaying the action the moment is actually asking of you. Number 3, weigh what's genuinely at stake. If it's bread, the discomfort of acting now is not optional. If it's small, you get to choose your timing without guilt. This week, I need you to name your fridge. Weigh what's behind it. Stop paying for blame and move it, even if you don't feel like it. So grab this week's premium worksheet in the show notes if you want to build this out fully. Because living in full expression means learning to read frustration for its message, not just its inconveniences. So go see what's behind your fridge. This has been the Life Podcast with me, your host, Manuel. And until I come your way in our next episode, keep living in full expression.